All right, with our Dash web part styles in place and our Office UI Fabric components imported and used in our React components for this Dash web part, it's now starting to look a little bit closer to being ready for production. However, there's one thing that we haven't really touched on and haven't really messed with just yet, and that has to do with the accessibility of this web part that we have been building. Now, in general, as far as web standards and accessibility goes, if you're using things like the Office UI Fabric, you're pretty much going to get some really good accessibility in there by default. You want to make sure that visually impaired users that are using screen readers can kind of tab through all the features inside of the web parts that you build, and you're following all those standards as you need. But the great news is that that's already been kind of accounted for in a lot of the stuff that we're using. So for example, all of our property pane controls that are here are built using those Office UI Fabric components. They're very accessible by default, and you kind of don't have to worry about that for the most part. Our button that we've used is accessible by default. Our loading message that pops up has an ARIA attribute on it that's going to announce that to visually impaired users and let them know that something is loading. And it's just, in general, you're just going to get a lot of that stuff baked in, which is very cool. But certainly any custom functionality that you build, you want to make sure that you're following those accessibility standards. So for example, if you have a visual element like an icon, make sure that you add a screen readable text description to that element so that screen reader users or visually impaired users know what that content is. That's really important. And also just making sure that you always kind of test things, like just go through and hit tab on these pages and make sure that the features of your web part are something that you can utilize. And also just in general, make sure that when you're building custom functionality that maybe doesn't use the Office UI Fabric, that you're using all those accessible modern web best standards, which is going to help you out in the long run. But also in terms of accessibility, we need to think about localization of this web part. In a lot of cases, SharePoint is used for enterprise level software, and your enterprise may be global. It may be something that's used by folks that speak different languages all over the world, and that's a very common use case for your web parts. And the good news is you don't have to do something custom in order to accommodate that in the SharePoint framework. It's something that's just kind of built in as a feature. And we've mentioned this several times in several past lessons because we have this object that's kind of part of the web part solution when you first install it. When you first create this, if you remember in our web part file, we had this thing that said strings dot, and it was, for example, for our description field, our property that's in the property pane, we had strings dot description field label. And that's going to be the feature that we can utilize to actually localize this web part so it can be translated into multiple languages. So you'll notice over here in Visual Studio Code, we have this within our Dash web part, we have this LOC or localization folder inside of that, and that contains a couple of files. First of all, you have a typing, which is this d.ts file. And this is describing the interface for the i-web part strings. And then it's declaring a module which you can then import into your files that has these strings in it. And within this interface, you'll see it has things like property pane description, basic group name, description field label. These are the ones that you just get by default, but you can create your own. And in general, what I do is I go through and I build out and I develop the web part and I make it work. Because while you're developing, you may find that the strings change pretty often. And I don't like to have to constantly go in and create a new entry in this interface and then go in and create a new translation for that in English before I can even just stick a string in to somewhere I need it. So I find it's a lot more efficient to wait until you're at this point where we're pretty close to done with this Dash web part. And now we kind of have solidified the strings that are going to be available in this web part. Let's just go through all of our components and our web part file, find all the places where we're using strings, and it's basically just going to be copy and paste from that point, which we can do it all at once in kind of one fell swoop. And you'll see once you've defined this interface, you basically just create for each translation of your web part, you're going to just kind of copy this enus file, which is just returning a JSON object, which is mapping each property in that interface to the English translation of that. And then that way, whenever you're building your web part, you can just reference strings.basic_group_name, and everywhere you reference that, it'll actually translate that into any language that you've done translations for. It's always going to default back to the ENUS, so that's the only one you get by default, but you could create other language files that are basically the same thing, but maybe you have French or Spanish or whatever in the value of each of these properties. The properties are the same everywhere, but the text on the right, the value of those properties changes for each language translation that you create. So we're going to do this now. We're going to set up both of these files. I'm going to drag them all up here. And right now, the only place where we're outputting strings is in our two React components and the -webpart file itself. So what we'll do is we'll just kind of go through these and update our interface first of all. And then once we've done that, we'll go through and we'll update our English translation file itself. So I'm actually going to pull this over into a separate tab here. And let's actually start with our web part entry file. I'll drag that one over here. And you'll see at the top of this file, if we scroll down a little bit, it says import star as strings from -webpart strings. So it's actually importing those strings from this file here, which is going to handle that translation for us. So everywhere that you utilize your string translations, you're going to need to make sure that you include this import star as strings from -webpart strings. And now that this is imported, we have this strings variable that we can utilize everywhere where we would normally just output a string that the user can see. So if I scroll down a bit here, the only place in the web part entry file where we use strings is going to be down in our property pane. So you'll see there's a lot of areas down here where we have some kind of string to describe what's in that property pane. So let's just take this -settings that you see here. I will copy that. We will delete this and we'll replace it with strings.property pane description. And now in our English translation file, we'll just paste the value that we had in there into here, and it's going to do the exact same thing it did before. It's just now pulling in a translation of that, which you can then translate into other languages. So now we have these basic group names and description field label. We don't actually need those because those were just created for us by default. So we'll go ahead and delete those from both of these files. And now let's continue to add other strings. So we have chart data. So we'll just call that strings.chartData. And that's going to be of type string. And then in our translation file, we can say chart data will be that. And it may actually be easier to just go ahead and build out this ENUS file, and we'll just copy and paste into here because all of these are just going to be strings in this case. So let's just work on this ENUS file, and then we'll update my strings afterwards. But let's come down, and we have another string here called list. So we'll just change that to strings.list. In a lot of cases, that's typically what I do is I just try to use something that's like super descriptive. So it's really hard to confuse that with something else. And if we go down here, we have another one called selected fields. So let's cut that and we'll say strings.selected fields. Let's add that back over here like so. And if we scroll down a little bit more, you'll see here's one for chart settings, strings.chart settings. And you kind of get the idea. So we're going to speed it up and finish all these other strings here. So we have, chart type, bar, horizontal bar, all these text values that appear in this property pane. And we'll just speed up the recording a bit so we get through these pretty quickly. Okay, cool. So we did all of the strings inside of our -web part. I also like to sort these alphabetically. Probably just me being crazy, but and then we'll take each one of these and we'll copy the index using multiple cursors, and then we can come back and very easily inside of this file, we'll simply paste those. And then again, we'll use multiple cursors to set each one of these to of type string. There we go. If we give both of those a save, And let's go ahead and save our dash web part file just to show you how that is still the exact same that it was before. If we edit this, you'll see all of our strings still appear. They're just being translated now. So we're viewing the English translation of each one of those. Great. So let's continue to do this. We'll jump over into our dash component, and you'll see this one just has a single string, which is select a list to continue. So we will need to import strings into this file. So let's go ahead and copy import star as strings. Let's paste that into here. And we'll replace this with an expression that is strings.intro. And we'll create that over here in our translation on the right. And let's add intro over here as type string. And let's copy our import star as strings from the dash component, and we'll come in and paste that into our chart, which is going to contain the last few strings that we need to add to our translation. So let's come down here into our render method, and you'll see, first of all, we have this loading chart data. So let's add a translation for that. And let's cut this out of here and paste it. And we will replace this with strings.loading chart data, like so. There's a couple more down here in our button. We have both a loading and a refresh. So let's add those. And then we'll replace these instances with strings.loading or strings.refresh. Great, and I think there's only one other one. We have an error message in a couple places where it says something went wrong, so let's create an error translation as well. And then we'll replace this over here with strings.error. And that's going to do it. That's all of our areas. So let's make sure we add these new ones to our interface. So let's copy those and paste those in here. And each one of these, we want to make sure they are of type string. And then once again, I'm really picky, so I like to alphabetically sort these. So we'll do that. That's a shortcut you can run inside of Visual Studio Code. You can also use the command palette to sort lines. So you can check that out. It's pretty cool. Anyway, so we have all of our translations in now. We have our interface defining those translations, and our web part is now fully translated, and everything's going to continue to work just as it did before. So if we jump into our local workbench here, you'll see all of the areas where we have a label or a property pane control or whatever. It's now all going to be translated, which is great. And just to test that out, we can open up our chart component here. We can check out the loading state. As you can see here, we can add an error of string. And then that's going to show up here. And actually, now that I see this, let's actually replace this with a message bar, just like we did in our dash component right here. We want that to be very prominent when an error actually occurs. So let's go up here and let's import a message bar into this file, and we will surround our error. Instead of a paragraph, we'll do message bar, like so. And let's change the message bar type to message bar type.error. And then you'll see after saving there, whenever we actually have an error, it's going to look a lot more prominent, and the user is really going to notice that something has gone wrong. So let's go down here and set our error to hello once again, and you'll see that's going to pop up and be nice and prevalent for the user. All right, so this is looking great. We have fully translated our web part, and it is now one step closer to deployment. And also, you finally know after all these lessons what that strings dot object was actually doing.